I never liked family parties. They were always a performance, a careful balance of smiles, forced compliments, and whispered judgments behind my back. But this one felt different, something in the air had a sharper edge, like the quiet before a storm. I arrived early, as usual, clutching a small bouquet of flowers for my aunt, hoping to blend into the background. The house was warm, full of laughter that never quite reached the eyes. My cousins were chatting in clusters, their voices carrying excitement about promotions, new apartments, and upcoming trips. I smiled politely when someone asked about my job, my small freelance work barely scratching the surface of their world of corporate titles and flashy success. Then he appeared. Uncle Victor, the one who had always enjoyed playing the family critic, the subtle tormentor, who had perfected the art of making someone feel small without ever seeming cruel. He patted me on the shoulder, a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "So, how's your career going? Still, chasing little dreams?" I forced a laugh. "Yes, Uncle Victor. Small steps, big dreams." He shook his head, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropping just enough to sound conspiratorial. "You know, your cousin James is doing really well. He's climbing fast. Well, you're barely moving. You'll never match him, you know." The words hit me like a cold splash of water. I felt my chest tighten, a familiar pang I had learned to carry quietly. It wasn't just about work, it was the pattern, the endless comparisons, the subtle insinuations that I was less, that my efforts didn't matter, that I wasn't enough. I smiled. A calm, measured smile, the kind I had perfected over years of family gatherings. "Then he can start writing my resume," I said softly, but with a clarity that made everyone stop mid-conversation. The room went silent. Even the background music seemed to fade. Uncle Victor froze, the grin slipping from his face, replaced by a flicker of something I hadn't expected, surprise, maybe even a trace of fear. I felt a strange warmth spread through me, not triumph, but recognition. I wasn't powerless here. I didn't have to shrink to fit someone else's standards or live under their shadow. The sting of his words was still there, but for the first time in years, I realized it didn't have to define me. Dinner proceeded, conversations moving around me like I was invisible, but I no longer felt invisible in the same way. My family's whispers and sideways glances didn't have the power to cut me down anymore. I observed quietly, noting the favoritism, the subtle nods to James, the way my opinions were often dismissed unless I wrapped them in someone else's approval. I remembered the nights I had stayed awake, replaying these family moments, wondering why I was always compared, always measured, always lacking. And I realized something, this wasn't about me failing. This was about them projecting their insecurities, their obsession with hierarchy, onto me. By the time the dessert plates came around, I had decided, silently but firmly, that things were going to change, not with a scene, not with anger, but with quiet, patient resolve. The first step was understanding. Observing. Choosing when to speak, and when to let silence carry the weight of my presence. That night, as I left the party, I felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and emotional ache, but underneath it, a seed of something new, strength. It was fragile, yes, but it was mine. And I would nurture it. After that party, the words lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Uncle Victor's voice, sharp and judgmental, echoed in quiet moments, "You'll never match your cousin." At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that he was just one person with a cruel streak. But slowly, I began to see the pattern. It wasn't just him. It was the whole family. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention during phone calls, casual visits, and even the occasional text. My aunt would ask about James first, praise his achievements with a warmth she rarely reserved for me, and only after a pause would she inquire about my life, often dismissing my work with a casual "Oh, that's nice." My parents, who I had always believed were impartial, frequently compared me to him, making subtle comments that I should try harder or take notes from James. At first, it hurt too much to confront. I had always been trusting, believing in the goodwill of my family. I wanted to see the good in them, to believe that they were just concerned or encouraging. But as I observed more, I realized it wasn't concern, it was judgment, wrapped in a smile. Every compliment to James was a reminder of my perceived inadequacy, every passing remark a quiet betrayal. I began keeping a journal, not for anyone else, but to track the moments that cut the deepest. The favoritism, the dismissals, the whispered jokes at my expense, these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. Patterns that had shaped my confidence, my choices, even my sense of self-worth. And yet, I realized something surprising: the more I recorded, the more clarity I found. I began to separate my worth from their opinions, even as their voices lingered in the corners of my mind. One evening, I visited my childhood room, now quiet and still in the house I had grown up in. I sat by the window, tracing the outlines of old photographs on the wall, family pictures, birthday snapshots, moments frozen in time. I noticed something I had overlooked for years: the smiles in the pictures were often polite, almost rehearsed, and my achievements, my milestones, were seldom celebrated with the same enthusiasm as James's. That realization hurt more than any insult. It wasn't a single cruel word, it was years of subtle neglect, quiet favoritism, and emotional dishonesty. The betrayal wasn't loud, it was hidden, like a slow leak in a foundation. And unlike anger, which flares and disappears, this kind of pain settles deep, reshaping how you view yourself and the world. But I refused to let it define me. I began to observe without judgment, to take note of the patterns and the moments of dishonesty, and to measure my own growth against myself rather than against them. I started small, sending out applications for projects I had long been hesitant to pursue, reconnecting with professional contacts, and quietly building the life I wanted. I didn't announce it. I didn't seek validation. I simply acted, letting time and effort do the talking. Each success, no matter how small, became a quiet rebellion, not against them, but against the internalized belief that I was less. Each step forward chipped away at the invisible chains of comparison, and with each step, I felt a new kind of strength, one built on patience, dignity, and a calm understanding that life unfolds on its own terms. I began to understand the truth slowly: the betrayal wasn't just theirs, it was also mine, in the sense that I had allowed their opinions to shape me for too long. But now, awareness became my armor. Observation became my tool. And the pain, once sharp and consuming, softened into a quiet determination. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving their judgments, I was preparing to thrive despite them. And that realization was both frightening and exhilarating. By the time the next family gathering came around, I had changed in ways that no one could see at first glance. Outwardly, I smiled, laughed politely at the jokes, and kept my chair close to the edge of the circle, as I always had. But inwardly, I had begun to build walls, not of bitterness, but of careful observation and self-respect. I had learned that silence, when wielded with intention, could be more powerful than any argument. The living room buzzed with the usual energy, my cousins comparing their latest successes, my aunts and uncles nodding in approval, and me, quietly noticing. I watched the patterns play out as if I were seeing an old film in slow motion. Every compliment given to James, every subtle dismissal of my own accomplishments, every smirk or knowing glance, it all registered. I no longer flinched. I catalogued. I learned. It was during a particularly noisy moment, when someone praised James for securing a high-profile promotion, that I felt the familiar twinge of old frustration. My first instinct, as it had always been, was to argue, to defend, to prove myself. But I stopped. I breathed. I remembered that my strength did not need to be loud or immediate. It needed to be steady, patient, and intelligent. I sipped my tea and smiled to myself. Let them talk. Let them cheer for James. I was no longer racing for approval that was never mine to claim. Instead, I quietly acknowledged my own progress. The projects I had quietly completed, the clients I had impressed without fanfare, the small but steady growth of my own career, all of it mattered more than their fleeting praise. Over the next few months, I began setting boundaries, subtly but firmly. When someone offered unsolicited advice that carried judgment, I listened politely, then moved the conversation elsewhere. When comparisons arose, I let them hang in the air without engagement. It was liberating to feel that I could protect my emotional space without creating drama. Each moment of restraint strengthened me, teaching me that dignity is often best preserved through calm, not confrontation. I also began to notice their cracks, the subtle insecurities hidden behind their boasting. Uncle Victor, who had once so easily dismissed me, now paused before speaking, almost as if he sensed that the old dynamics were shifting. James, too, seemed a little more guarded, perhaps because he no longer had my deference as a given. I felt no glee in observing this, only quiet acknowledgement. Their reactions were consequences of their own behavior, and I understood that fully. In my private life, I pushed further. I accepted opportunities one had once thought too ambitious, networked with confidence, and pursued skills that made me stronger, not to outshine anyone, but to honor my own potential. Each achievement, no matter how modest, became a quiet affirmation of who I was, independent of their approval. By the time the next holiday rolled around, I was different. Not in appearance, though my posture had grown steadier, my gaze more assured, but in presence. I no longer carried the weight of their judgments. I could participate without fear, smile without compromise, and listen without shrinking. My silence had become my power, and my observation, a tool for clarity and understanding. For the first time, I realized that strength was not measured in loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. True strength was quiet, patient, and resilient. It was the calm confidence of someone who knew their worth and refused to let anyone, even family, dictate it. And in that quiet, I began to feel an unexpected peace, a sense that the slow, steady reclamation of my dignity was already its own reward. It had been almost a year since that fateful party where Uncle Victor had sneered about my career. So much had changed, yet nothing felt loud or dramatic. Life had unfolded quietly, steadily, in ways that my family hadn't noticed, or perhaps hadn't expected. The next family gathering arrived, and I entered with the same calm composure I had cultivated over months. I was no longer nervous about comparisons, about whispered judgments, about the subtle hierarchy that had once made me shrink. I had built a life that was mine, a success measured not in applause, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had done it on my own terms. James was, as usual, talking about his new promotion at a large firm. The room's eyes were on him, their admiration palpable. I smiled politely and made small talk with my aunts and cousins. I listened rather than competed. I didn't need to. Then, as dessert was being served, a conversation shifted toward work achievements. Uncle Victor, probably sensing an opportunity to belittle, leaned toward me with that familiar condescending smile. But I didn't flinch. I met his gaze steadily and said nothing at first. A pause hung in the air, and then I casually mentioned my latest project, a campaign I had designed for an international client, which had been recognized in a professional publication. I described it simply, without bragging, letting the details speak for themselves. The room went quiet. Even James stopped mid-sentence. Uncle Victor's smile faltered. "Oh, that's impressive," he said, almost stumbling over the words. But there was no venom in his tone this time. Just surprise, and perhaps a dawning recognition that I had quietly built something meaningful while the comparisons had gone on. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My smile remained calm, composed, confident. I felt a warmth in myself that had nothing to do with their validation. I had done this for me, not to prove anything to anyone. And in that moment, I realized that quiet triumph was far sweeter than any dramatic confrontation. Later, I stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. I watched the sky darken and the first stars appear, and I felt an unusual lightness in my chest. The comparisons, the favoritism, the subtle betrayals, they no longer held power over me. The emotional chains had loosened, and I had replaced them with patience, dignity, and self-respect. In the following months, I continued to grow, not in visible ways meant to impress, but in steady, meaningful ways. My confidence strengthened, my work flourished, and I learned to value myself without the constant echo of family judgment. And while my family eventually took notice of my achievements, it was never my goal to make them see. The real triumph was internal, the recognition that I no longer needed approval to feel worthy. One evening, reflecting on the journey, I realized the truth I had slowly uncovered: life doesn't demand dramatic victories or revenge to teach a lesson. Sometimes, the most profound lessons are carried in quiet patience, in setting boundaries, and in cultivating inner strength. By letting go of the need to fight every battle or respond to every slight, I had found not only peace, but emotional justice, a natural consequence of living with dignity. I had become someone who could smile at judgment without flinching, who could stand beside favoritism without shrinking, and who could thrive quietly while the world continued its chatter. And in that quiet triumph, I understood the most valuable lesson of all: self-respect cannot be taken, it must be claimed, nurtured, and protected. As I looked back on that night with Uncle Victor, I no longer felt the sting. Instead, I felt a calm, unshakable pride. He had frozen then, but now, it was I who had risen, silently, gracefully, and without needing anyone's approval to validate my worth.